documentation is so important, and we're very lucky that the Vue team has done such a great job putting together such fantastic docs for us. Now, as great as the documentation is, though, sometimes it's not always easy to find answers to your questions. I know that often it takes me some time going through several sections before a full picture gets formed in my mind and I can actually know what I'm doing. So my hope is that for those who are brand new to Vue or those who have used Vue for some time, that these videos would be just a nice complementary resource that you can refer to time and again to answer some of your questions and to help you understand Vue a little more deeply. I'll be going through each section of the documentation one at a time, and that's how I'll divide these videos. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any updates. And if you have any questions or any suggestions, any part of the docs that I haven't explained thoroughly enough, then please let me know, and I'll be sure to help out in any way I can. Now, with that said, let's get started. First thing we'll do is we'll go over to the Get Started link here, and this begins at the introduction section. So this video is all on the introduction, and we'll work through it step by step. Now, it's worth having a read at the top here, and definitely watch this video that the team created. It's really nice. They've done a good job, and it gives you a nice overview. Don't get too lost in the weeds when you start comparing to other frameworks, though. Let's just work on getting to know Vue, and then as you know Vue more, you can better compare it yourself. Because really, in my opinion, the best framework is the one that you know the best, you're most productive with, and the one you enjoy working with. So that's it. Moving down to the Getting Started section, it is recommended that we do not start with the CLI. So we will simply start with bringing in the Vue code via a script tag like that. We'll use the CDN link to get started. So hop on over to anywhere on your computer. You can create a new folder. I'll just call this Trip Through the Docs. And open that up in your favorite code editor. And let's create an HTML file, and we'll just call it Introduction so we know what section we're working with. And we'll just do an HTML file like that. And we'll bring in the Vue code with this tag right here. I'm going to put it at the top just so I know I have it. Right there. And we'll copy over the example from the docs to get started and play around a little bit. So we get started by looking at declarative rendering, and this is just showing us how Vue hooks into different parts of the page and how it can update content, it can update information. We're going to start with a simple string. So we use this top section here. This goes in our HTML, so it goes between our body. And then the second part here, this is JavaScript code. So I'll add this to the bottom of the body within script tags. And that's how we'll work right now. Of course, you're free to put the JavaScript in a separate JavaScript file and bringing it in with a script source like this. But really, let's just keep things simple and work through as it's shown in the documentation. So what we're seeing here is how Vue connects to everything within the data object and makes it reactive. So if you want something to be reactive, something that Vue will update automatically, you must declare it right here within the data object. Now, actually, let's step back a little bit first because a little more context will help. What we're doing here with new Vue is we're instantiating a new Vue instance. And we're telling Vue to hook into the ID app. That's why we have ID app up here. So of course we can call this whatever we want. If I call this my app, then I have to do the same here. I'm hooking into the ID. That's why we have the hash there, my app. And we're instantiating a new Vue instance with new Vue. And this app variable is available globally. So if I open this in a browser. So let's open this up in Google Chrome. We have our Hello Vue. We'll open up our inspector, open up your console here. And if you type app, you'll see that we have app there as a global variable. So that's everything that's on the Vue instance right now. The Vue instance was created. It's being referenced by the app variable. And if we open that up in the console, we can see everything that's there. Feel free to poke around a little bit. It's not a bad idea. You'll see a lot of terms that are throughout the documentation, so this helps kind of make the docs a little more real for you if you can explore in the console like this a little bit. So we'll go back to our code now. So we're attaching our new instance to this element in the body, and then we're declaring our data. So we have data and a message property on that data object. This whole object right here that's being passed in, this is called the options object. So you're passing in all the options, all the configuration that you want when you instantiate this new Vue instance. We'll be using this a little bit differently shortly, but just know that this object right here with L and data and all these other properties we'll work through over time, those are all part of the options object. So what's happening here? Message, we've set our message to a string of hello Vue. Now, if we want to render that out in our actual HTML, then we just use our two curly braces here and we just put message. And that's it. So I can change this to anything I want from the console even. You can access the message property at this, app.message, and we'll just set a new property here in our quotation marks. Let's do hello world, and you'll see it change right away over here in the, right there over on the page, hello world. And that's what the documentation says that we can do. You can change it in the console. See, it describes reactivity right here, and you can open your JavaScript console, change app message to something else, and you'll see it rendered right away. So that's what we just did right there. Let's move on to the next one. In addition to text interpolation, we can also bind element attributes. What does that mean? We don't only have the ability to take this message and output it as a string that will be seen right there on the page. We can also bind to attributes on an element. What is an attribute? Well, here's an ID attribute. You are likely familiar with the class attribute. For images, you have a source attribute. Okay, these are all attributes on an element. We can bind to these. That means that whatever we bind to them, the reactive data that we connect to them, that we wire up, then it'll be equal. So what are we binding here? Let's take this example. We'll do app2 just below. Actually, I'll change this back to app just so we're right in line with the documentation. App2, so you can guess, since we need to wire up to an app2, we probably need a new Vue instance. And do they provide that? Yes, they do. Let's copy that, put it right beneath. Now we're hooking into app2 and we have a different data message. You loaded this page on, etc. So the message here is being bound to the title attribute of this span tag. And if we open up our page, refresh, we'll see here, if we hover our mouse over this text, you'll see a title attribute pop up. So let's hover there. See the title with the date and time? That message right here is being bound to the title here. The text that you're seeing is just what we've entered right there in the page, but the title is being bound. Now, vbind, you'll often see shortened to just a colon. You don't have to put vbind. You can just put the colon there and that will bind it automatically. So now that we see how that works, let's try something else. If you hop over to the docs, I want to highlight some more of these for you. Now, quick note, actually, a vbind is called a directive. Now, these directives, they're prefixed with a v dash, and they allow you to do special things to the element. I want to show you where you can see all of the directives that you have available to you. It's worth looking at. So if you go up to the search bar, you type in directives, you'll see that we have a guide section. So all of these links are where directives are found within the guide. That's what we're looking at right now. But we also have the API. So if we open this, I don't want to open it on a screen, but these are the documentation for the API. So API 2.x is what we want. And you go down here to our where are we looking for directives? There we go, directives right there. We have vtext, vhtml, vshow. Let's try vtext. I want to play with that one. So I'm going to keep this open. Open up a new tab. Let's drag that over here. I want to keep track of my guide. Okay. So let's try vText. And we have a nice example here. So let's try vText message on that span. And it even explains, it's the same as what we did in the first case, just using our curly braces. So go to our code. Let's try another div down here. And by the way, whatever I add has to be within the app ID or the app2 ID for the instance to be able to affect it. We can't put something outside because it will be outside of Vue's control. So I'm going to put another div here, and I will bind using the short form. I'll bind the text to equal the message. And I don't have to put anything between here. You'll see that the message will also appear within that div tag. So open up our example again, refresh. Oh, let's see. Hello Vue, let's change this. Actually, I'm going to comment that out. Oh, it's not vbind, my bad, vText. Should have paid more attention to the documentation, right? It's vText. Wasn't thinking. So let's go back to, where am I going? Too many tabs. Refresh, it's still there, even though I commented it out here. Let's uncomment that. You'll see it appear twice now. So now we have two. So one's within the div that I just created, bound to vText. Let's try a vHTML. Should be the same thing. Now HTML, of course, this one is expecting that you're actually binding to an HTML string. So I could actually change this. Instead of here, let's try something new. Let's use our backticks right here, and I will put in a link to google.com. Why not? So I should be able to bind this HTML string right here, right to this part. And I have to reference, when I put HTML here, I'm referencing this down here. So I can actually change this to my HTML. That way you know I'm not using an actual like HTML tag or something. And this link should render within those div tags. So go back to our example, refresh, here we have our Google link. That's it. So that's kind of a neat directive to use, actually, vHTML. Now, before moving on, I want to show you one more thing with the vHTML directive that's important. You may not want that HTML actually rendered as HTML. So in our code here, we have an HTML string right there. We may not want to actually render that link, but instead show raw HTML on the front. And that is spoken about right here, data binding, syntax, interpolations. If you open that up, you'll see under text. So we're not there yet in our docs, but I want to show it to you anyway. In our docs, if you want to show raw HTML, you put it between the curly braces. So in that case, you'll see all of the HTML code, whereas if you bind it to HTML using the vHTML directive, then it'll actually be rendered as HTML. So that's important to know. Okay, moving on, let's go to the next section in our introduction, conditionals and loops. This is something you'll use a lot of, and it's fun to practice with, so this is a good next step. Let's start with this app 3 example. So we have our app 1, our app 2, now we have app 3. Oh, forgot how to paste. And our JavaScript right there. So again, we're having a new instance created right here. We're hooking it up, we're wiring it up to the app 3 ID. And we have a different property here this time. We have seen. And we're looking at the vIf directive. Now vIf is similar to vShow. You'll want to use vIf when you're trying to render out other data here that may not always be available. And if you try to do a vShow in that case, often you'll see an error in your console that such and such a property doesn't exist on the component, but you're trying to render it. So if you see that error, you know that you need a vIf instead of a vShow, or there may be some other way to fix it as well by setting a default value or something like that. But often you'll see this when you start working with components and parent and child components. You try to render a child component when some data doesn't exist yet, you'll get an error. So often you'll solve that quite easily with a vIf. So in this case, we're not showing this message. We won't show this element at all until seen is set to true. Now, right now it is set to true. I'll just put some margin on this, just to kind of separate it from, how much do I want? 20 pixels. Just to separate it from the stuff above there. So we'll refresh this. Now you see me. And if we set this to false, now you don't. It's gone. And actually, if you inspect the area, you'll see that the element, the span tags, aren't even there. See, span isn't even rendered. Now let's see the difference between vShow. It's still set to false, but we refresh. We'll see that the span tags are there, but it's set to display none. So remember, the vIf is when you don't want that element to even be rendered. vShow is when you just want to set it to display none. And with the vShow, you may get errors, so a vIf may be a better solution. Now let's go to the next section and see what else we're working with. After the vIf, now let's do the v4. v4 is awesome. This is how you will render out lists. So let's work with our app4 example here, and you'll see how that works. If you've worked with Angular at all, this will look very familiar. App4, let's bring that example down. So what's happening here? Our data this time is a to-dos array, and each array has a simple object here. We can iterate over this array using the v4 directive. And the syntax is v4 equals to-do in to-dos. So the to-dos is obviously our array, and to-do is the name we are giving to each element in that array. So each index of that array, we're naming it to do. This is where you put it. This doesn't have to correspond to anything in your code. To do's has to match though. This has to be your array, and this is your singular form. Now you can also take out the index and stuff. You don't have to only use the name here. You can also, or you can give this any name you want, by the way. You can say my to do. It really doesn't matter. And then within the for loop, within that loop, you then reference each individual item as the name you gave it. And then we're using the .text right here to access the text property on the object. So what's actually being rendered out is an object each time, and we have to access the text property on that object. That's why we have to do .text. Now, as I was saying, we can also access the index here. So let's try our API, see if I can find it that way. v4, oh yeah, we have it right here. Here we go, v4 item and index. We can pull it out like that. Now, I'm glad we came here because you can see that we can also iterate over objects, which is very cool. That's pretty handy. You don't have to transform everything into an array in order to iterate over it. So that's kind of neat. So let's try pulling out our index here. Let's play around with this a little bit. So our item is the to-do. Index, you can name this index or IDX. It really doesn't matter. And let's put our index in curly braces, just like that. And let's see what we spit out on the front end here. So we'll go back here, we'll refresh. So we have learn JavaScript, that's our index 0. Learn Vue is index 1. And build something awesome is index 2. Now let's say to-dos was an object. Let's try that. Let's try an object. And of course, each of these items in the object needs a key. So let's change this to a 1, a 2, a 3. And let's go back to the docs. We have, let's see, for objects, we can access the value and the key, or the value, the key, and the index. So let's try all three. Let's see what we have. Here, value, key would be the second one, index would be the third. The order matters, of course. If I were to name this index this key, well, then it would be flipped. The index would be the key, and the key would be the index, you see? So we have to pull it out in this order so we kind of know what we're doing. And equals the key. Let's put our key right here. Now let's see what we have. Refresh. Now we're iterating over an object, not an array. So we have our index 0, but it's key 1. Is it key 1? Yes, it is. See? Set up our key number 1. Learn Vue is key 2. We've got that. And key 3 for the last one. So that is very helpful. And as far as I know, at least the version of Angular I was last working on, which I think was 1.4 or 1.5, we didn't have this as far as I know. So having that here is really helpful. Now let's read over this next part together because this is important. The default behavior for v4 will try to patch the elements in place without moving them. To force it to reorder elements, you need to provide an ordering hint with the key special attribute. So I ran into this when I was working on a customer list, and I was doing a lot of filtering of that list, changing of the details in that list for each customer, and reordering, etc. Using the key was necessary to make sure that things work properly and that things were performant. It's not a bad idea even just to put it there all the time, just so you never forget. And you'll want to bind the key attribute to something unique, of course. That's why they have the ID here. So let's do that. Let's hop on over to our code and we'll add that in. Now, of course, to reference the key here, so key or reference to the ID rather here, but to do ID, we actually have to have an ID on the to-do object, which we don't yet. So we'll just add one in here. ID equals 1. And we'll do ID is 2 and ID 3. There. And then that'll make sure that that will work properly. Okay, moving on. Checking out our docs. Let's see. Handling user input. This is where stuff starts to get really cool. So let's build a form. Okay, so let's start with a button. We'll start app 5. I'm going to start to collapse some of this because this is getting a little hairy. Let's close those up a bit. App 5. There's our code. So what are we looking at? We're dealing with a new directive, VON. VON click. This can be shortened to the @ symbol. And you put the @ symbol there and click right away. You don't put a colon there or anything. You just do @click. And when the click is fired, when the button is clicked, and you can attach this to any element, by the way, it doesn't have to be a button, then this reverse message method will fire. So this references a method, and this is the first time we're looking at methods. So one other property on the options object that you pass into a Vue instance is methods. And in here you have an object, and each item in the object, each key in the object is the name of a function. Very important. You must use a function here, a named function. You cannot, or rather not a named function. You have to use the long form for function. You cannot use an arrow function here. If you do that, this will be all screwed up and it won't work. So you have to use function here. So it's not like the Vue guys are not cool, not using arrow syntax, the fat arrow functions. This is really important because of the way fat arrow functions deal with this. So we have our reverse message, and if you're extra cool, you can actually just do this. You don't need all that. You can use the shorter form, which is what I tend to do. Reverse message, and you're changing the value for here. So this message refers to the message property on our data object. Being in the data object, it is reactive, and when we change its value, it will update automatically in the DOM. So how do we do this? We're taking our message, we're splitting it up. So we're taking that text, we're splitting it up and forming it into an array. We're then reversing that array, and then we're rejoining them again into a single string. That's what's happening. Our message is hello VueJS. So let's make sure we have it first. We have hello VueJS, and when we click this button, the click handler right here calls reverse message, and there's our message being rendered out just above. It will reverse it like so. And we can reverse it again and again and again, and that's how that works. So you can imagine with this click handler, you can do all sorts of stuff. Now the next step is binding to inputs. So you can imagine now we can, even with just this little bit of information we're about to cover, we can create a pretty cool form and handle a click to send it off to a server or bring up a modal, whatever. So let's create our app 6. Actually, that needs to go up here and down here, down there. Okay, so our app 6, we've got a message and it's being rendered out right there. But in our input, we have another directive called vModel. So let's take a look at that. Our vModel documentation in the API is right there. So we can add this to an input, to a select, and to a text area. That's what it's limited to. Good to know. So don't try to hook this up to anything else. It just won't work. So what's happening is it's saying whatever you type into this input, whatever you choose in this select, whatever you enter in this text area. Oh, and by the way, this isn't quite up to date. You can also bind this to radio buttons. I know that for a fact. And what else comes to mind? That's all I can think of at the moment. But you can bind it to radio buttons as well. I know that. Because elsewhere in the documentation, it does exactly that. So let's bind. So what was I saying? Whatever we enter into this input field, this will bind the value of what's put in there, and it will update the message properties. So these two messages right here, they are one and the same. Whatever you enter here, it will change this. So let's reset, or refresh rather. We have our hello view. See, hello view is down there in the input as well because they're connected, right? If I want to update this to hello world, you'll see it change right above there in real time. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Let's try hooking these two up. The reverse message, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put them down there. Add a new method down there, reverse message. I will take this button and I will add it down here. So now I'm saying when I click the button in my new app 6 HTML, I will reverse whatever I enter into the input. So let's refresh. We have our hello view. Can reverse it. See, it even reverses within the input field, which is kind of crazy. Hello world. And I'll reverse that. There we go. So that's pretty neat. You can see how those work together. Back to our documentation. Composing components. Now, it's really tough to cover this without going too far down this rabbit hole, but we'll do our best here. Now, components, first of all, if you've never used a framework before, like React, for example, the idea of components is that your UI, your app, can be divided up into little sections, making it easier to manage and then easier to reuse. So you can have a component that you can reuse over multiple different contexts. An example would be like a sign-up form for an application. You don't want it stuck on one specific page all the time. You may want to place that all over the place. And if you've put it in its own component, it makes it that much easier to share it and use it as you want without having to rewrite a whole bunch of application code. So that's the idea behind components. Give that a quick read here. Now, how do you create Vue components that can be reused again and again? Well, if you hop back over to our code, you'll see that we've been creating a new Vue instance each time and wiring it up to a new section of the HTML, a new ID. That's not really, obviously we can't do that for a large application. We can't be managing 5 different instances of Vue. So instead, normally you just have one instance, and then within that instance you define a whole bunch of components that you can reuse and place around as you want. So in the docs, you'll see that we have this way of creating a component. So you're hooking into the Vue global variable and you're calling the component function on there. You're giving the component a special unique name, and then you're passing in an options object. That's what's happening here. So let's define this, and we'll do it right at the top to make sure that it's available. All right, so we have Vue component. We have to do it at the top to make sure it's available in the instances as we call it. We'll call this our to-do item, just like the documentation. And so anywhere in our instances, we should be able to call to-do item. So let's test this out and see if we've got it working right. So we've got our to-do item here, and you add it to an instance of Vue like so. So it looks like an HTML element, and you should make sure that you hyphenate them. Apparently, where does it take note here? Okay. Elsewhere in the docs, Vue mentions that they don't enforce using the hyphenated versions of the components, but it's considered best practice to do so. So try naming your components, or at least when you use them in a section of the app like this, use it like that. And going forward, you'll see that there's other ways to do it. But for now, just try to name your components like so. So we can add that to our app 6. Let's go over here. We'll refresh. Do we have it there? Yes, we do. So there it is. And we can add this to any of the components, any of the Vue instances that we've created. So let's add it to number 5. We'll put it above the message. Add it there, go back. So we should see it up here. We have it right there. So that's a reusable component. It's a global reusable component. And as we move on, there are ways to create new components that are not global, but are more local to another component rather than global to the whole application. But we won't go that far just yet. So go down a little bit more, and you can read a bit more on how to share data between the two components. Let's just cover the really basic way, and that is to use props. So we have our parent component, which will be any one of these instances, app 6, 5, etc. So let's start with app 6. This is our parent component. And to send data down to a child component, we set up attributes like so on the component tag right here. So in the example, we're passing in the items, so the grocery list. You know what? Let's jump back here and we'll actually add this in. This will be a lot better. So app 7 now. Let's go down to app 7 is right here with a to-do item component. So let's comment this out because we have the same name, to-do item. So I'm going to take that out there, take that out there, so we don't have any problems. So we're binding to-do. Remember, this can be just a colon, doesn't have to be vbind. We're binding the to-dos, the item. What's the item? Well, the item is in a grocery list. So we know from the v4 that we did earlier, grocery list is an array. So let's go down to 7. Sure enough, we have an array with a list of groceries. Each grocery object has an ID and a text. So we're iterating over this grocery list, and each item in the grocery list, we're naming it item. Now we're binding a special attribute called to-do to item, and then the key to the item ID. What's with this to-do and key though? I don't know where those are. That is what the child, being the to-do item component, that's what the child is looking for. So go to our to-do item component definition, and you see that one of the props is to-do. So this to-do prop connects to this to-do right here. So you're binding a special attribute. You can name it whatever you want right here. You can call it my to-do or grocery item. You can call it whatever you want. And you're saying this is the prop in the child, meaning the to-do item component. This is the prop I want you to be ready to receive. So we're passing down the data, we're passing down the item data, and on the other end, you're going to receive it, and it's going to be named a to-do. We could also call this item. If you want to name it the same thing, we could call this item. And that should work just fine. Where is it? Right here. Item. And then we're also passing down key. So we can come down here and be ready to receive key. And so the props, should be a string. The props is an array, and there's more than one way to do this. If you want more details on this, by the way, I have another video on communication between components. The first part is specifically on this, parent and child communication. So if this isn't enough, you can deep dive over there. So it's waiting for item and key to be passed down up here like so. So let's go over here to our browser. We'll refresh. Reference error, key is not defined. So that's good. Key is not defined. Key should be right there. Good. I'm glad this happened. Let me step back a little bit. I'll name this a to-do. Name this a to-do. I'll step back to what the docs actually show and see if we still have an error. No, we don't. So I broke something. Let's try this key now. Oh, you know what? That's my mistake. I can't name that key. That's reserved. This is a list. I can't grab that in the child. Awesome. I forgot. I'm so used to seeing just the colon syntax that my brain wasn't working properly. Remember, with iterating over a list, you have a key attribute that you bind to make the list more efficient, that the view can do what it needs to do. So we've bound the ID to that, just as I mentioned up above here, right there. So that isn't a prop. So my mistake. I wasn't thinking. So this can be named item. You can name it whatever you want. Remember, we'll go down here. We'll name it item instead of a to-do. Oh, can't do that either. Oh, that's why. Here. There we go. So I renamed it item. And then once we pull it in this way, it is available within the code for component as this.item, or as it was before, this.todo. So I just backtracked right there. This.todo. So you can see that this is useful because iterating over a list is a common thing. And if you have different data each time, but you want to render out that list with the same styles and everything like that, then it's a good idea to have a component like this that kind of compartmentalizes all the styles, maybe even some click behavior, you know, some clicking. When you click on it, maybe you want to do something like edit it in a modal. These are all candidates. This all means that this is a candidate for a reusable component, and you just pass in different data each time. So in this case, we're passing in an item from our grocery list. So let's go back to the docs and see what else it has to say. This is worth a read when it explains a little bit more about why it's beneficial to have different components, and it just makes the app easier to manage and reuse different parts, as we've already gone through. And then if you're interested in web components, there's a little note here about how the work that Vue's doing with its components, how it compares to the web component spec. And that's about it. So if this helped you at all, please let me know in the comments. Give this video a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe, because I will be going over the Vue instance section next. And then we get deeper and deeper as we go. So I encourage questions and suggestions, feedback if this was helpful or not. If I missed anything, if you want to go over anything in more detail, then I would like to know it. Subscribe, thumbs up. See you next time.